Welcome to the first lecture of Unit 9. One of the abiding themes of art history is that every generation views the previous generation's art with a highly critical eye and a determination to produce something newer and better, or at least newer. So the classical Greek sculptors thought the archaic sculptors were too stiff, and check out those goofy smiles. The Hellenistic Greek sculptors thought the classical sculptors were cold, emotional purists, while the classical Roman sculptors thought the Hellenistic Greeks lacked dignity. The Renaissance artists called their predecessors Gothic or barbarian. But let's face it, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, these guys are tough acts to follow, especially on their home turf of Italy. Nevertheless, the next generation rather bravely decided to rebel. I'm kicking off this unit on Baroque art with the immediate heirs of the Italian High Renaissance, a period that art historians have somewhat confusingly labeled Mannerism. It's a kind of way station between Renaissance and Baroque art. So let's begin by considering the work of an artist who outlived most of his own generation and traveled the road from High Renaissance to Mannerism in his own paintings. The Last Judgment is a very prominent element in the Sistine Chapel, which is a required work. But in the College Board course description, it only shows up in the full photo of the Sistine Chapel, not as an individual image. On the other hand, you may have noticed that the Last Judgment featured rather prominently in the AP classroom questions. On this slide, we see two fresco paintings by Michelangelo, both created for the Sistine Chapel, but painted almost 30 years apart. Of course, the subject matter is different, and the Last Judgment is inherently a rather grim topic. Still, what changes do you observe in Michelangelo's content and form? In the earlier painting, God the Father appears powerful, but not really forbidding. In the Last Judgment, God the Son, Christ, is a genuinely scary figure. Even by Michelangelo's standards, Christ's body is almost grotesquely muscled, powerful to the point of seeming, at least to my mind, dangerous and even threatening, especially since he's gazing down, not at the saved, but at the damned. Even his mother, pictured behind him, seems to be cowering a little in Christ's presence, unlike even the earlier painting, who looks eager if a little shy as she rests under God's sheltering arm. It's really hard to see this huge and complex painting on a single slide, but I wanted to give you a quick look at the entire composition. Note that we're seeing, in some ways, a return to the complex and crowded composition that we saw in Michelangelo's first ceiling fresco panel, The Flood, and which he largely rejected for the rest of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. You have an extra credit reading on a very interesting short book excerpt that digs deeper into The Flood. I hope you take advantage of the opportunity to learn more and to raise your grade. Here, by way of comparison, is Raphael's School of Athens. What similarities and differences do you observe? Both paintings, it's true, include a large cast of characters, but Michelangelo's Last Judgment seems to me much busier, even frenetic. The figures are twisted, moving, dramatic. The School of Athens, by contrast, is much more orderly and rational, even soothing. Michelangelo's painting is pretty clearly intended to unsettle the viewer, and presumably to turn our thoughts toward our sin and its consequences. It's a much, much less confident and self-congratulatory painting than the School of Athens, and as such, it reflects the spirit of this later age. I'm going to get there, but first, let me note that one reason we find this painting unsettling is its choice of colors. We haven't talked much about color since our first unit, but take a look at this color wheel again and pay special attention to the tertiary colors. These are not colors we see as often in paintings. When we do, painters are generally using this color palette to jar our senses, to startle us, to disturb us. It's a little hard to pick out, but Michelangelo has moved toward a greater use of tertiary colors in the Last Judgment. This is characteristic of Mannerist paintings. The jarring effect, again, is entirely deliberate. Looking again at this comparison may help. Note that the colors in the creation of Adam are brighter, that is, they have higher values, but they also tend to employ primary and complementary, not tertiary colors. And here we see a detail of Michelangelo's portrayal of the damned. Note those writhing, distorted figures, the sense of movement, the high drama, and the heavy emotional impact. We are moving into the Mannerist period and even into the Baroque. But by the true Baroque era, the church and its artists will have regained some of their confidence. The paintings will be dramatic, but less unsettling. Stay tuned. Here's another detail of the painting of St. Bartholomew, who was martyred by having his skin flayed off. He's shown here holding his own skin. What's rather creepy is that Michelangelo has given the skinned saint his own face. You see a contemporary portrait of Michelangelo on the right. And remember this Michelangelo portrait from the Sistine Chapel, this time as Holofernes, slain by Judith. So what might be inspiring this grim outlook? By the time Michelangelo was painting The Last Judgment, life in Italy and Europe was pretty grim. The wars over whether Europe would be Protestant or Catholic became entangled with wars between two Catholic monarchs, Francis I of France and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. They were fighting over which king would rule the continent of Europe. Italy mostly just got ground up in the process. In 1527, Protestant German soldiers who were fighting for the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor mutinied since they hadn't been paid, and they marched on Rome. They spent several days in a rampage of killing, rape, and setting everything in their path on fire. We also know from Michelangelo's letters and poems that he was deeply troubled by the turmoil in the church. Indeed, he seems to have had some sympathy with Luther's criticism of indulgences. As he grew older, Michelangelo was also plagued by a sense of his own sinfulness and doubts about his own salvation, again, kind of echoing Martin Luther. And finally, Michelangelo was once again fighting with a papal patron. The Catholic Church was finally taking Luther's call for reform seriously. The new Pope, Paul III, who was not a Medici, set out to end many of the abuses that had helped spark the Protestant Reformation. This was the Pope who convened the Council of Trent, which launched the Catholic Counter-Reformation. One of Pope Paul III's reform efforts brought him into conflict with the now elderly Michelangelo. This is just too good a story to skip, so let's watch a short clip about this event. The only one today, I promise. Gotta love an artist who gets nicknamed Large Underpants Man, but we need to move on. The term Mannerism is actually a 20th century invention. As you'll discover in the spring, 20th century artists and art historians love to complicate our lives with endless isms. So, we've had a glimpse of Mannerist style and an introduction to one element in its cultural context, the wars of religion and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Another important contextual element of Mannerism was the court patronage of the Italian princely courts, now including the Medici, who've been raised to the status of nobility and are back in power in Florence as noblemen. The video clip you just saw was from the fourth episode of the PBS documentary on the Medici that some of you watched for extra credit over Christmas break. But these were not the old quasi-republican Medicis. The Medicis were now Grand Dukes, and their world was a world where elegant style was often seen as more important than rationalism, and elegant artifice was honored above naturalism. This painting is not a required Mannerist work, but it's a famous example that I could imagine showing up on your test. You read about Mannerism in your homework, so what Mannerist elements do you see in this painting? The Renaissance strove for a kind of realism, getting the bodies right, getting the proportions from perspective right, announcing the artist's interest in human beings and life here on earth, by getting away from what they perceived as Gothic distortions. Distortions reappear in Michelangelo's Last Judgment and in these courtly paintings as well. Note that the hands and feet are often out of proportion. Sometimes they appear almost boneless. Mannerists were especially obsessed with hands. Beautiful, useless hands were a sign of aristocratic status, a little like bound feet of Chinese women. The faces are often hiding their emotions from the world. Mannerist artists were also obsessed with masks and with an aristocratic culture where people deliberately masked their emotions and intentions. The whole painting has a rather chilled, emotionless quality, again, typical of courtly Mannerism. We're going to get around to our required work, I promise. But first, I want to talk all too briefly about the painter whom I think is the most interesting and important Mannerist, but who has mysteriously disappeared from the required works list. El Greco just means the Greek. I put his real name up on the slide, but he's always referred to as El Greco. Born on the island of Crete and trained as an icon painter, El Greco did spend some time studying in Venice and taking in the works of Titian and his followers. But El Greco spent most of his working life, his last 37 years, living in Spain, where he soaked up its fervent spiritualism. St. Teresa of Avila, whom we'll be meeting soon, was a Spanish saint, and capturing its bright, stark light. This is probably El Greco's most famous painting. Used to show up in the AP exam all the time, but it's no longer on the list. So I won't linger except to note that El Greco divided his universe into a lower earthly sphere and a higher heavenly sphere. Earth is portrayed realistically, and indeed it reveals El Greco's Venetian training in the use of light and color. Of course, it also shows Mannerist conventions such as pale, elongated, aristocratic faces. But note how the heavenly spheres explode into contorted shapes, jarring tertiary colors, and a whirling movement that contrasts strongly with the solemn, still figures below. Okay, this one's really in here because it's one of my favorite paintings, but I think with a stretch it could be called a Mannerist landscape. And here's one more that I really love. Check out El Greco's rendition of one of my favorite Hellenistic scenes. Yeah, I'm basically pissed that the ECB ignored one of my favorite artists and a very important Catholic artist as well. But getting over it. Let's move on to our required Mannerist work. So, why the double title? We don't really know if the painting depicts an entombment or a deposition because we don't see the cross or the tomb or any other useful spatial or landscape clues. Renaissance painters made much more effort to produce realistic settings, even for their religious works. This descent from the cross or deposition or entombment seems to take place in a kind of artificial space. What other Mannerist elements do you see in Pontormo's painting? Well, the bodies seem almost weightless. Who is supporting Christ and why isn't he heavy? The positioning of the legs seems staged and unrealistic. While much more emotional than the Madonna we just saw, the emotion still seems almost posed or contrived, theatrical rather than real. Back to those masks again. The colors, too, are startling. Paler, more orange than red. Again, we're seeing those tertiary colors. In a few minutes, you're going to be comparing this to other earlier and later depictions of the same biblical scene. But first, I just want to flash a couple more Mannerist works at you just to help you recognize the style. You could easily be hit with an attribution question. You saw this on the Khan Academy video, I hope. Excuse me. It's a fresco in the same chapel where the deposition entombment hangs. Note the elongated figures and twisted bodies. Any guess about who designed and built the chapel that houses both of these works? Hope you guessed Brunelleschi. You're right. Bronzino was an apprentice of Pontormo. Note how he portrays skin almost as if it were a porcelain mask. In part, this reflects the aristocratic audience for Mannerist works. People who did not need to labor in the sun were pale, right? This is an even more famous work by Bronzino, a portrait of Cosimo I's wife. Note the porcelain face, the emotional aristocratic calm, the extremely elegant dress, and those boneless, elongated hands. The Medicis were now the Grand Dukes of Tuscany and patrons of Pontormo and Bronzino. We've come a long way from the first Cosimo and from the artists he sponsored. Christ being removed from the cross or laid in his tomb was a popular theme in Renaissance and Baroque art. It's a moment that captures Christ's humanity while also carrying with it enormous spiritual power, a connection between earthly and heavenly realms. So I'm going to shut up now and let you think about 6 different artistic renditions of this famous biblical moment. If you have time, Mrs. Whitaker is going to put you into groups, and each of you will get one of these works to analyze, along with some questions to direct your thinking, put here on the slide, and they're also in your workbook. And here are the 6 works. Again, they're all in your workbook. Wish I could be there to hear what you have to say.